Capacity Building Stories is a podcast series brought to you by the Paris Committee on Capacity Buildings Network, in short, the PCCB network. Through these episodes, we aim to create a space for capacity building experts, practitioners, and enthusiasts of the PCCB network to share their work, experiences, and best practices around climate-related capacity building. My name is Radhi Datta, and my pronouns are she, her. Both as your host and the coordinator of the PCCB network, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome our audience to this second episode. In today's episode, I sat down with three of our youth representatives who were speakers at our Youth in Capacity Building side events, which was hosted by the PCCB in collaboration with the PCCB network at this year's Region Climate Weeks. So the PCCB organized 3 side events with the overarching theme of the role of youth in capacity building at the Latin America and Caribbean Climate Week, Asia Pacific Climate Week, and the Africa Climate Week. So we're joined by the youth representatives from those side events, and without any further ado, welcome to the second episode of Capacity Building Stories. So our first guest that was a panelist at the Regional Climate Week of Latin America and Caribbean at the Youth and Capacity Building side events organized by the PCCB in collaboration with the PCCB network. Giovannik Henry is with us today. So without any further ado, Giovannik, welcome. I'd like to give you the floor. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, good day. I'm certainly delighted to be here. I'm really Giovannik Henry, of course. Dialing in from the warm weather of the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, predominantly working alongside with the Caribbean Youth Environment Network as the climate change special envoy. I'm certainly delighted to join you, and of course, with the PCCB network. And I look forward to the discussion today. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Giovannik. So before we go into your work and everything that you discussed at the side event, I think this is a constant question that I will be asking all of the speakers at this podcast. What is your first memory of climate change?
Yeah. I think, interestingly, mine is a very, probably unique memory of climate change, where it was back in 2013. And it was actually Christmas Eve. And, everybody, I think, no matter what part of the world you are, beliefs, etc., it's always, kind of supposedly a good day. And unfortunately, back in 2013, for us in St. Lucia, we were hit by this low-level trough system, which was a major shock to everyone, particularly since we have the hurricane season, which runs from June to November. So experiencing such a disaster, which took about 6 lives and damaged several bridges and infrastructure damage across the island. And again, this is a very small island, of course, only 238 square miles and roughly, 180,000 people. So that is significant, to lose so many lives, and the amount of damage, particularly that, again, like I said, it was outside of the hurricane season. So that, I think, created shockwaves across the island and across the region, seeing that, it was a very extraordinary event. And then that's when I really began to look deeper at what were the potential causes of that. And then, of course, I began, a bit more interested into seeing this whole climate change issue. And of course, not too long after that, we go from 2013 going to 2015, where particularly for us as the Caribbean region and alongside the Caribbean Youth Environment Network, pushing that 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign. So it was almost like I got my shock in 2013, and in 2015, around the Paris Agreement, we got that huge, I got that platform where I could actually directly engage and learn a lot. I think that was critical as well, and a really turning point for me. So yes, the memory in 2013, but I think definitely, going into the 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign. And of course, we know how important this was for us, to achieve the Paris Agreement as small and developing states. I got the opportunity to actually learn and to actually contribute, meaningfully to that. So I think, my first memory, supposedly, on Christmas Eve should have been a good day, but it definitely wasn't a very, a day that will remain in our history for quite a long time. And I think not only myself, but many persons became to great clear understanding of the climate change issue following that natural disaster.
I mean, there is no way to sort of turn around a natural disaster on a positive note, but I can say at least maybe in your personal journey, the point where you realize I have to do something and got involved in all of these different processes, right? It was lovely to have you at our side event because when we were sort of envisioning this side event, for the Latin America and Caribbean Climate Week, we realized that often there is a disconnect between Latin America and Caribbean. And there were multiple discussions that we have even had around that, right? So at the side event, you discussed several aspects of youth involvement and capacity building for climate action. Could you sort of elaborate on your point regarding the role of youth in engaging each other, and maybe even bring some examples of how do you bridge the gap that exists between Latin America and Caribbean and the youth in these regions?
Yeah, maybe I could just speak it first in terms of not the challenge, but that sort of gap which within Latin America and Caribbean. I think we're making good progress. In a sense that of course we have quite a very maybe diverse in terms of the challenges we face, climate challenges. Of course, we're predominantly islands, within the Caribbean region, and of course you have most of the mainland territories as well within the Latin American. And of course you have the language barrier, so which in fact I must say maybe we not get too much into the challenges, but it really and truly can be a major challenge in terms of really pushing climate movements and climate action. But I think we're getting over that hurdle, and you can see there's increased collaboration between the two regions. Of course, I mean collectively with agenda, the same objective regarding climate action. So it's all good on that end. I think in particularly for me when it comes to youth and capacity building, I think I've always said at this stage it's a case where it should no longer be optional, but it's a mandatory requirement for effective climate policy development and implementation. For me, that is essential. Particularly when I think we've seen the case that young people have that potential to be, I'd say, innovative and creative, in a sense that obviously both good and bad, we have to be honest, but there is that unique creativity when it comes to designing and whether it be projects, etc., and implementation. And I always feel that, of course, we know, I'm not going to get too much into the science and the facts, where we know for a fact that, as young people, we stand to be affected most in terms of employment, in terms of, our future, etc. So I think it's almost a case where you're at a stage where who better to design, training, etc., programming than those who are mostly affected. Again, utilizing their knowledge, utilizing their innovative skills, etc., that will allow them to actually design more what I consider context specific, and that will actually to meet the needs. So for me, in a sense that is why, so for example, within the Caribbean Youth Environment Network, for example, we have chapters from across the region, reaching from as far west as Belize, down in mainland Guyana, etc. So there is, and of course, not forgetting the islands, even the Eastern Caribbean, Barbados, St. Lucia, Grenada, etc. So there is that sort of diversity into the challenges, because whereas, for example, us in a small island, we may have threat of hurricanes, etc. This may not be the case in Trinidad, but of course, all your young people are still affected by climate change in both instances. So there is that potential, and particularly that's where networks are critical in being able to develop what I consider programming that is able to meet the needs. So of course, the environment, what is required. So particularly one of the things we're trying to focus on a lot more is how we can support young people and youth-led enterprises to accessing finance that could allow more youth-led climate action, particularly within the post-COVID-19 recovery era, because of course we know governments will be cash strapped, and the global financial, I call it the global financial crisis essentially that we're in. But that is sort of the envelopes for youth-led climate action. The difficulty is accessing it, and of course having the necessary capacity that will allow us, as your youth-led entities, limited capacity that will allow us to actually, go through the funding proposals, etc. So within even my local community here in St. Lucia, particularly in my village where I've been, particularly within this COVID period, placing a great emphasis on helping to identify what are the key funding outlets out there, two, also building the capacity of those, engaging in training, etc., that will allow other young persons to be able to know what is required, what are you needed to do in generally to access this, this general funding lines. Because of course, I cannot be just doing, on my own. There has to be that knowledge sharing, which is a critical component. And particularly with us as well as the Caribbean Youth Environment Network, there is a great emphasis on, knowledge sharing across the regions, because you would have persons in different levels in terms of knowledge around the climate change space. Some would have been involved in, at the national level. For example, now that I'm involved at the multilateral level, you have varying point of views, varying knowledge, which could actually strengthen the network, strengthen young people within the sharing that knowledge. So I think definitely it's a case where, like I said, the financing is a critical component we're focusing on, because we believe that if we can develop that sort of framework where we have young people, develop a cadre of young people across the region and beyond, who can, access and the relevant financing and technical support required to upskill the initiatives, it can actually, contribute to the national development objectives, and it all goes well for all. I mean, of course, that sort of independent spirit is always better than, having to be totally dependent on the mainstream facilities.
Wonderful. So we'll come back to the NDCs a little bit later. But I think another thing that you mentioned at the side event was how these one off and ad hoc approaches to capacity building are not what we need as of now. Could you please elaborate about the need for a permanent approach to capacity building and engaging youth in climate action that you referred to? What does a permanent approach entail, and what is not happening right now that needs to happen in your view?
Yeah, I think actually that's very quite a good example to share on that point. First of all, I think it's important that we reach a stage where it's institutionalized youth in climate policy development and implementation. I think the implementation part is also critical as well, where we don't only speak about designing it, but then when it's implemented, we're not nowhere wrong. So one of the things which I think to developing towards making progress to that permanent approach, for example, within St. Lucia and many other countries I know of now, that within the national climate change committees, where they ensure that there is a youth representative. So, for example, even for us on our end as the Caribbean Youth Environment Network, where we have a representative who sits on that committee. So it's one of the direction from the national level, but is also able to contribute meaningfully to what programming the committee develops, etc. So that is actually a very, it may seem very simple, but it's actually a positive step in ensuring that you have that sort of permanent, engagement of young people and youth views in youth in climate action. Because at the end of the day, for me, it's a case where you have to be able to mainstream youth across all areas of climate action. It's important, and I think the critical role is to ensure that you have that sort of youth input. Not only when it's required, just call up a youth entity and, can we get your views on that? I mean, yes, that may be good at times, but it needs to be formalized as well. I think in that way, you develop a greater level of, I don't say respect, but it develops a greater sense of, the value to your contribution. I'm knowing that there is a permanent approach to that as well. So I think that is one of the fundamental steps that I would encourage, countries to ensure that within your national climate change committees or whatever it is that you develop, that you have that sort of youth representation that can actually gather the views and contribute meaningfully to policy development. That for me is a permanent step. Of course, we're in the COP era, and of course, there's a lot of push to ensure that national delegations ensure that they have that sort of youth representative. It may not even necessarily at the COP, but within your deliberations in leading up to COP and post COP, I think it's also important that you have that sort of youth input. Of course, including youth in the negotiation process is actually fantastic. I mean, that is a critical, is a very positive step for countries who would take that step. So these are things that we can push to ensure that, because within these negotiations, etc., you're actually building the capacity of that young person that they can now go back and share that knowledge. So particularly in some of our countries within the Caribbean region, where we just focus a lot on capacity building. So I know, for example, Grenada with the Caribbean Youth Environment Network, they're focusing a lot on, COP capacity building the capacity of young people to understand the COP process, because that is fundamental. Understanding the process, I think, is essential to allowing you to be able to contribute meaningfully, and of course to share that knowledge widely. I will say that it's good that you can have a youth COP army essentially that can push the agendas that some would want to push at any time. Of course, but the knowledge is essential, and getting that understanding and experience is also critical. So I think that is a critical way to ensure that we have a permanent approach to building capacity of young people. Again, using that what I call a snowball approach, train one to train others. Yeah.
I love that snowball approach. But speaking of institutionalizing and formalizing youth engagement and representation, I think across all three of our side events, there was consensus in that young people have to be involved in developing and implementing the NDCs, right? So could you tell us a little bit more about successful examples of youth engagement with NDCs, either from your work or an organization that you work with or a partner that you worked with? I'd just love to sort of put out a best practice or an example out there, that people could use then.
I think I can even use the local example here at St. Lucia. Of course, we know that ahead of COP26, many countries would have had to submit their revised or updated NDCs, and there's a call for increased ambition, etc. Of course, even from the St. Lucian context, I think one of the useful examples was that we invited, I think, to several consultation process dedicated towards getting our youth inputs, and I think that you're actually now in our revised NDC submitted in January 2021. There was that sort of increased focus on adaptation and linking that to youth and gender aspect as well. These were two new, features within that compared to the initial NDC submitted years ago. So for us, that was a huge success in a sense that when we were engaged in that process. And I think it's a case it's important that you have to look at it from both sides of the coin. It's not a case where, we're asking to be engaged, but what are you doing that will ensure that, you have that sort of visibility? And I think that is always the challenge to young people, that we need to ensure that, if their networks, etc., that you are actually, actively engaged within your communities, within your countries, etc. You make yourself in a position where you cannot be ignored. So I think that is what we probably building on, like what I mentioned earlier, from the 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign back in 2015, where we pushed that really strong youth drive. I think this was a milestone which will allow that sort of presence of there, like, hey, young people in the Caribbean region, young people in St. Lucia actually quite engaged in climate action. If we are revising our NDCs, let us engage them. I think so definitely we had quite a few of consultations and within that process, and like I would have said, the revised NDCs definitely placed focus on us, which was good as well. And I think even going forward as well, that now that we've been, as we're hopefully going to implement our NDC process, you see that sort of constant is like, I know we're all now virtual and there's tons of Zoom meetings, but there is that constant request for you want that your input in this. We want your idea or your input on how we can progress our to our adaptation targets, etc. So there is that sort of presence, and I think that is a positive example where we can see that, one, where youth began their own initiative, two, the government, etc., reached out to ensure that there was that sort of within there as they're designing the policies, and three, now there's a joint collaboration. So I think that is a good approach. I think a model that is to say where all parties are involved positively and can make a meaningful impact working together. I think that is important as well.
I picked up two huge things from your answer so far. One, the snowball effect, and then the last intervention was almost like there's like a pull and push. While youth are pushing to be included, the government has to include them, and then that collaboration take that forward, right? Absolutely love these two ideas. So my final question for you, I know you do a lot of different kinds of work. So how can our audience that's listening to this podcast best engage with your work and your organization's work?
Yeah, certainly. Again, so I would thank you for this opportunity here, and I think definitely we're through the Caribbean Youth Environment Network. Like what I said, we span over several countries across the Caribbean region. So, and we continue to expand not only within the region and beyond. So I think definitely you can reach out to us via all social media, essentially, Facebook, Instagram, through our various chapters as well. But definitely our main website at cyen.org. I think it's a central hub where you can find particularly we have the Stay Alive and Thrive campaign during this whole COP26 movement and various partnerships with developing. So I think definitely you can reach us through the main website here and cyen.org. That's once again. And I think definitely we can see we're always open to partnering across, whether it be as far as the Pacific or in as close as within the America, Latin America, or so on. Of course, I'm always open to, you can reach out to me at any time. My social media handles are always LinkedIn, etc. Definitely feel free to reach out, and I can definitely see how we can work together, because at the end of the day, this climate crisis requires our collective efforts, and there needs to be collaborative action across all stakeholders. And I think definitely, as we know, COP26 will be a turning point. I have already said it has to be successful. I'm putting that out there. So definitely we need to provide our supportive actions to ensure that our implementation actions can actually be to the benefit of not only for us, but for future generations to come.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jovanek. It's been lovely hosting you and sort of hearing more about what you had, some of these things you had mentioned at the side event, but to get a little bit delve deeper into some of those elements. Thank you so much for being here. And we are very excited to see what CYEN has in store and like what your future has in store as well. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah. So thanks again for the opportunity.
So for the final side event of Youth and Capacity Building series, hosted by the PCCB in collaboration with the PCCB Network at the Regional Climate Weeks, this was in the Africa Climate Week, we had Elizabeth Gulugulu, who was representing the youth perspective. She is a climate change activist, passionate about food security, sustainable food systems, and youth leadership and participation, and of course, mainstreaming gender into NAP's Elizabeth, a warm welcome to you. Would you like to please introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Rudi. So, as you have mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Gulugulu. I'm based in Zimbabwe. I work for a youth organization called African Youth Initiative on Climate Change. I'm also part of the Children and Youth constituency to the UNFCCC, where I'm the contact person of the Nationally Determined Contributions Working Group.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It was wonderful listening to your interventions at the side event. But before I go into some substantive questions, I would like to ask you this. What is your first memory of climate change?
Wow, I think I was very, very young. I think 9 years or 10 years old when we were affected by Cyclone Helene, and it was the talk of the town. Everyone was talking about Cyclone Helene and especially how it had affected and ruined people's homesteads, their livestock, their crops that they had planted. So basically, I can say that was my first memory of climate change. But by that time, I really didn't know it was climate change. But I heard these things that there are massive waters that have killed people, that have, ruined people's homesteads. But as I was now growing up and studying along those lines, I got to realize that, actually, that was climate change. So I think that is my first memory.
Yeah, I think for a lot of young people, that is the way. I mean, at very young ages of 8, 9 is where we see a natural calamity or something similar to that, or we read about it in our books. So that goes to show how youth are so involved and are affected by climate change, right? So at the side event, what you had mentioned was how often these policy processes and jargon is very difficult for young people. We see many young people saying that, we don't understand this language. It's difficult to get to be a part of the process. And you sort of mentioned how as young people, we have to be more proactively engaged with the processes, may that be the NDCs or any other policy action process, right? So how do you think can the youth in African region build their capacity in terms of the necessary and relevant skills required to be proactively engaged in the NDC process?
I think that is really a difficult question to say, but to be honest, it all starts with interest. What are our interests as young people? That's where you should trust. And what are the things that are affecting us the most? In my case, where I stay, we've been having water scarcity issues. And definitely when I was growing up, my mind was based on how can I change the way we are living, because I cannot travel for like approximately 5 kilometers all the days of my life. I need to advocate for this. So first and foremost, we need to identify the challenges that us as young people are experiencing, then come up with the interventions, certain interventions. For example, I gave you the water scarcity issues that we're facing. I recently highlighted on the floods that were happening. So as young people, we need to be proactive. The things that we think do not matter, they actually do matter. If we feel like policy issues are not so relevant in our lives, then we will continue being affected by those things because we are not speaking up, we are not following the policies, we are also not capable of submitting our interventions. So it is always good to listen to older people and the older generation as they speak. What are they talking about? How is it going to affect young people's lives? How is it going to affect issues to do with gender? How is it going to affect my future? So we need to shift our priorities to things that are in the future. That's what we really need. And most African countries, most UN and developmental organizations, they're offering these capacity buildings for free. Actually, most of the times they call for meetings, young people are not there, So we really need to shift our mindset and learn to concentrate on the most important things that really matter, things that have to do with our future, things that have to do with food security, things that have to do with income generation, financial flow. Those are the things that we should start building interest into. And the moment we do that, it is easy for us to offer our submissions as young people. It is now easy for us to follow those policies, even understand the policies. So I think this is what I can really say. Most of the times our priorities as young people, they are sort of like diverted. But the energy we have is amazing. So we just need to channel that energy in the right direction.
Oh, I absolutely love that. Channel energy in the right direction and amplify voices, right? And I absolutely love the fact that you mentioned how, often youth are just considered as one whole group, right? But there are so many diverse experiences, privileges, and contexts that we come from. And I feel like finding the right priority and working with that and channeling energy towards that is the way forward. So while you sort of mentioned what young people can do, I would love to get to know how can youth be better engaged in NDC policy formulation and implementation? You can bring up examples from your region as well, but just in overall with your work with Youngo, I would like to understand how can youth be better engaged in such processes?
First and foremost, young people should be engaged from the beginning as stakeholders. We should be rights holders of certain policies or certain initiatives that are being introduced. The most thing that we do not want young people to feel is for them to feel as if they are being tokenized, them that they are just simply being invited for the sake of simply being invited. So young people should be invited, should feel that they own the project itself. For example, what happened here in Zimbabwe, we were called by our UNDP office here, and they said, guys, we have some funds that should be directed to youth programs. So we want to hear what you want to do with these funds. We came up with a number of ideas. They gave us the option to go and write down our ideas, and we submitted to them. They assisted us in shaping up our ideas, which is what I mentioned previously, that our energy is amazing. It has to be, shaped in the right direction, which is what they did. They supported us. After that, funds were given to us, and all we needed to do was to offer capacity buildings to our fellow youths who are in the rural communities, who do not have access to this information, but at the same time, this information could be important, could unlock certain opportunities for them. So this is what we did, and we felt as if we were stakeholders. We felt as if we owned this because we drafted the concept note, we came up with the agenda, we initiated the discussions even when we went on the ground, we engaged our fellow young people, and we were in total ownership of the whole event. Even when we concluded the project, we came up with a youth policy brief as young people, which we then submitted to the government of Zimbabwe. And we said, this is what we came up with as a group of young people. We have identified these gaps, but in as much as we have identified these gaps, we feel like it is also our role and responsibility as young people to offer the energy, to offer the innovations that we have, to offer the skills, certain skills that we have, so that we meet country's targets of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030. So it all starts with meaningful youth engagement. The moment you engage young people meaningfully, then they'll do amazing things.
Said, and I really like the example that you brought in of how it was the best case, and a great example of how meaningfully youth were engaged in a project from cradle to the end of it, right, to the delivery part of it. That being said, at this side event at Africa Climate Week, we had a special focus on building resilience. Could you give me a little bit of an idea of how you think youth capacities are important and can be used in building resilience in the region? And specifically, given that we are in the COVID world right now and we want to recover better from there, could you bring some best examples of that?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm glad you mentioned something about the pandemic, how as young people we could feel as if it's really important for us to build our resilience. In most developing countries that are often being affected by climate catastrophes, and then on top of that, we experience this global pandemic, COVID-19, and people are talking about building back better, Building resilience to us means that we are not breaking, in as much as things are difficult, in as much as things are tough. We can bend, but we are not breaking up. We need to come up with strategies. We need to come up with innovations on how we can learn to live with the effects of climate change, on how we can learn to adjust with how the pandemic has affected us. This is what resilience means to us. For example, in some parts of our country which were affected by Cyclone Idai, up to now, people's houses, they have not yet been built. Up to now, people are still afraid, even when it's just raining, when it's not even heavy rains, but because they were traumatized. But us as a group of young people, we managed to go to those places, we engaged with our fellow youths, and we came up with, with certain opportunities that were there, in as much as that place had been affected deeply by the effects of climate change through that cyclone which had affected them. You find out that through building community resilience, there are a lot of opportunities like jobs, land-based jobs for young people, So it's a matter of building resilience, at the same time making sure that young people are secured. They're getting some sort of income generation from the projects that they are doing. It could be coming up with climate smart agriculture initiatives like fish farming, so that they can adapt to the effects of climate change, initiatives like beekeeping, initiatives like afforestation projects, etc. But this has actually helped young people, in as much as we are saying, okay, fine, we want to live with the effects, we want to learn to live with the effects, we want to be resilient, but there are opportunities that are there for young people. And as we are trying to do that, we're making sure that young people, even the communities, are eating healthy, they are being safe, they are protecting themselves from the global pandemic. And this is the only way we can build back better, making sure that insecurities of people are being met, making sure that young people, they are employed, and the employment is just not employment, but green jobs actually, which are sustainable.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. So my final question for you, we've heard so many different examples that you've brought up through different projects that you've been involved with. But to all of our audience members listening and young people that are listening to this episode, how can our audience members best engage with your organization and the work of Youngo and your work in general?
The Children and Youth Constituency to the UNFCCC is an open platform, open to any young person below the ages of 35 years old. If you think you're interested into policy issues and you'd want to learn to be a negotiator, this is the right place for you. What I would want to say is, within this constituency, we have managed to get amazing support from the UNFCCC itself, from UNDP, from the NDC partnership, from UNICEF. We have been doing massive consultations on the NDCs and also capacitating young people on how they can play a very pivotal role in the NDCs implementation in their respective countries. If you hear people talking about NDCs and youth, don't think this is something that is far-fetched. This is something that you can actually lead in your certain country or in your community. You just have to reach out to your government or reach out to UNDP. They will tell you where to go and what to do. The platform is open for everyone, and you can just Google it and you can get more information on how you can join Youngo. Yeah, that's what I can say.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It's been a pleasure hosting you for this episode and getting to know some of your experiences and making linkages with your interventions at the side event at the Africa Climate Week that PCCB hosted last month, actually. Thanks again for all of your work, and we are very excited to see what the future holds for you and the places that you're going to go.
Thank you so much for having me.
So at our Asia Pacific Climate Week side event organized by the PCCB in collaboration with the PCCB Network Youth and Capacity Building, we were joined by Kathy, who is a member of Youngo. Kathy, welcome. It's lovely to have you here, and it's my pleasure to host you. But before we begin, could you very shortly introduce yourself?
Many thanks, Ridi, for having me, and also it was great memory joining the APEC Climate Week. So briefly introduce myself. I'm Kathy Itong Lee from Youngo and WGC. Mainly follow the UNFCCC processes from a youth perspective and a gender perspective. And I mainly follow technology, finance, and other topics like capacity building and ACE. Also, specifically that as we're very close to COP26. I am also one of the One Step Greener ambassadors of this COP. So very much looking forward to it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kathy. So before we go into your work and your experiences, this is my first question to all of the other panelists and speakers at this podcast episode as well. What is your first memory of climate change?
I guess probably similar to many other children, and also, of course, I'm no longer a child, but youth in my generation is we've seen it. Very luckily, we've seen it in books, in children's books, and also in the news when we were kids. So we have this broad understanding of climate change, that it is happening and that it is an important issue that civil society and that the governments have to deal with. And probably that the generations before us didn't get the chance to have this in mind when they grow up. So I think that's something quite important and quite helpful. And also, of course, in terms of examples, we've probably all seen it in the news about wildfire and also global warming, and also, of course, that kids love animals. So we've also seen issues related to biodiversity. So yeah, I think we are a very lucky generation and generations that we have this understanding since we were kids.
Very rightly said. I mean, over the last 20 years, there's been so much that has happened in the landscape of climate change, climate action. And we are, as young adults and children, very aware of the changes, right? All right, let's move on to some of your work. And as you were one of our panelists at the Asia Pacific Climate Week side event, during the side event, you spoke about how youth must be involved in climate action. But before that happens, is there a conversation? Is there a frank conversation that has to be had? So my question is, do we need to be more frank when talking about climate change to children and young people?
Yeah, the answer is of course. And of course, our generation and also the generations to come, we understand things far better than the so-called adults expected. And also that I think it's sort of like a misunderstanding that people always think that we don't really know the technical side of things. But of course, when you think about youth from, Youngo, the youth constituency of the UNFCCC, our definition of youth is anyone under the age of 35. So many of us are, for example, scientists, scholars, and really doing an amazing job in research and also or in implementation or policy level, and also many of them are negotiators. So indeed, we're not just kids that don't know anything about technical side. And at the same time, not only because we have many of us have technical knowledge, and also we have ambition and we have innovative solutions and we have really amazing ideas and also passion, which is also very important, which is also, and also, of course, we have many skills that some adults are jealous of. For example, our power, so-called power on social media, and for example, some colleagues may remember that at the 5th meeting of the PCCB, that Youngo offers support on social media engagement with the PCCB. So that is indeed like an element that youth and children are very passionate and about and very good at. And so, of course, that because, and for many companies, they see, and also many organizations and governments, that youth, when they're not happy with something, when they think something is not right, they're very brave these days that to say it out loud on social media. So of course, it's important to be frank, or else there's this very direct way to let the whole world know. So of course, even just to think about their short-term monetary profits, many organizations do have to consider to be very frank when they talk to children and youth. And not only for the private sector, but of course for governments, it's also important to be frank, especially that the generations, our generations and the generations to come, are the ones who will take all the consequences of climate change. So I can't really think of a reason why not to be frank with them when they're the key stakeholders. Yeah.
I see that at the event as well, we spoke about capacity building because the title was Youth in Capacity Building, right? But before we can, start mobilizing youth capacities, it's also about sort of recognizing that there are these capacities that youth have. Just like you mentioned, like may that be social media skills or knowledge. there is a vast capacity element that young people bring to the table as well, right? So, segueing right into my next question, I think I want to explore the capacity building barriers a little bit. So, looking back at your experiences and work with youth engagement, what are the biggest capacity building barriers and gaps in Asia specifically?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, probably from a few perspectives. And one is, of course, very obviously that many civil society organizations, they find it very hard to raise their voices in some nations specifically. And because of the structure of governments, they might not be very interested in listening to non-governmental voices, especially civil society stakeholders. And of course, that it is in some way understandable because economic growth is so important for those nations that they just prioritize them and tend to put society stakeholders at the last, which also leads to another question is that the lack of financial support of many nations, non-Annex 1 parties, and also especially LDCs and SIDS from developed countries. So that is also, I guess, another barrier and gap. But we've also seen many support from countries, for example, the technology mechanism of UNFCCC, the implementation arm CTCN is doing a great job in supporting developing countries and supporting the most vulnerable countries in technology transfer and development. And I think specifically about youth engagement, of course, as mentioned, civil societies find it very hard to advocate for things and to raise their voices, even to express their views in some nations, and let alone youth who are the most vulnerable among one of the most vulnerable communities and stakeholder groups. So I guess in terms of barrier, it's really hard sometimes for them to engage directly with national policy level or even subnational policy level, which myself sometimes find it much easier to just use the top-down approach to just raise their voices and give them the stage, encourage them to speak up in the UNFCCC process through the youth constituency, and in that way demand their governments to raise their ambition and to increase their to have more actions on that side. And so, which is a bit interesting because people would have assumed that it'll be easier to convince our national governments than saying something at the UN and to drive ambition from that. I mean, myself and many fellow youth who are passionate about this field find this way very interesting. And of course, bottom up, as mentioned, the importance of social media. So also, I guess this is a really amazing tool, although there are, of course, youth advocates that we hear every day saying, of course, social media companies, many of them, tech companies don't pay tax, so they're very evil. But at the same time, they do help tremendously in terms of youth and other civil society stakeholders raising their voices directly without many barriers historically created.
So you mentioned a couple of gaps over there, and in order to bridge some of those gaps, I want to actually pick on the access to finance one, because that's something that came up from your intervention at the side event. And I know that you work in the financial sector as well, right? So I'd want to know, what are some of the successful examples of how youth can be engaged and sort of youth capacities can be used to allow them to have access to finance and then use these financial instruments for meaningful work, right? And if you could bring some examples from Youngo as well, that would be amazing.
Yeah, definitely. And yes, it is very interesting that I'm sort of like living in two worlds. My profession, I work in private finance in a non-climate team. And then on the side, for extracurriculars, I also do all this. So it's very interesting that I get sort of like a taste of what private sector is like and also how it runs and also about youth engagement in a UNFCCC process. So I think it's a very interesting combination. And in terms of, for example, capacity building, specifically, for example, on finance, Youngo's finance has a finance and markets working group with about 100 passionate youth. So, and actually they're working on a project to map the finance flows, climate finance for youth specifically. And I guess the project, of course, is not concluded yet, but our current finding is that very challenging for youth to access climate finance. And another example, because I also follow the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC, and actually at the annual forum of the Standing Committee on Finance last week, the SCF, in reply to my question on civil society engagement and youth engagement, they actually mentioned, how challenging it is that they are aware of that. For example, youth-led projects, it's very hard for them to reach the level of GCF and NGEF, and also that many big projects of GCF and NGEF might just be adopted and then be granted, and then just stay in the bank account for like 4 or 5 years, and then the project gets cancelled. But then if we use the same amount of money but to invest in a few youth-led projects, we might get more rewards and then more progress made in these 4 or 5 years. And so indeed, we think that capacity building, specifically from a financial perspective for youth, is very much lacking. And also, for example, it's very challenging for many Global South youth to participate in UNFCCC processes because now we're moving back to in-person meetings, and it's very challenging for youth to, for example, fly to Bonn or Copenhagen to join in-person meetings. Although, of course, there are virtual options, but it's also challenging in terms of like internet connection and other ways. But I guess nevertheless, from Youngo, what we're doing in a few ways. One is working on projects to map, for example, finance for youth, and also other areas, for example, adaptation for youth and other processes and ways of youth engagement in anything related to climate change. And then at the same time, we also host capacity building sessions like events. For example, we're hosting a few to prepare youth for COP26, for example, if they've never been to a COP before or they don't know much about UNFCCC process. So in that way, sharing knowledge is also something we're doing. And also, of course, at COP16, the UN Climate Change Conference of Youth that we're also hosting, one of the very main goals is to build capacity for global youth and to really empower them and to give them, a place to raise their voice as well. Yeah, and I guess one last point is, of course, to collaborate with other civil society organizations who deal with implementation, because Youngo as a constituency would mainly advocate in the UNFCCC processes. So, for example, if we collaborate with Fridays for Future and then other civil society organizations that deal more with implementation, is also we find it very rewarding.
Perfect. That's so much of work. I mean, I absolutely love talking to you. It's so inspiring to get to know everything that Youngo does, and you do as well, right? And I must say, it is the best of both worlds. So you work in finance, private finance, but you also do, even if it's for extracurriculars, very meaningful work. So speaking of social media, we have been following your LinkedIn a little bit and seeing what you've been up to in the last couple of days. Could you tell us a little bit more about your collaboration with the Global Center on Adaptation, please?
Yeah, sure, definitely. So my little role, another extracurricular at the Global Center on Adaptation, is as a youth advisor to their CEO. And of course, by name, Global Center Adaptation, is not hard to guess what they do. They deal with adaptation. So and also they have very strong attention on youth engagement. And the amazing Adriana is currently leading the youth engagement team there. So so happy to have the opportunity to work with her. And so as a member of among the youth advisors to the CEO, we're called the Youth Adaptation Panel and Youth Advisory Panel. And then at the same time, the GCA, the Global Center on Adaptation, also has a youth adaptation network that our panel leads. So it includes so many youth who are passionate about adaptation, and we organize, also share knowledge with them, and to explain to them what adaptation is. And also, for example, we had one yesterday specifically about cities, and next month we'll have one about specifically actions in Africa on climate change, and to really share views and build capacity for youth to understand more about different topics under climate change. So in terms of how people can get involved, I guess definitely just take a look at Global Center on Adaptation's website, and then specifically their youth adaptation network. And there's so many ways they can engage either in the youth adaptation network and its work, and also in projects, dialogues we host.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Kathy. It's like I say, your work portfolio and extracurricular portfolio is rather chunky, but wonderful work that you do. I know one of our other speakers for this podcast, Elizabeth, has sort of already mentioned how you can get involved with Youngo, but I feel like when I was a master's student as well, I kind of wanted to join in and I didn't know where to begin, right? Because I mean, even Youngo is like, there's so many different things that's happening. So while people might already figure out from Elizabeth's sort of intervention on how to join, could you give us a little bit more about how and where can one start from if they want to get involved with the work of Youngo?
Yeah, definitely. I guess Liz definitely mentioned this. You can find us on all the social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and not sure if we have TikTok, but I'm pretty sure we're on all the major social media, and also we have our website. So yeah, if you just take a look at our social media, and also of course you can join us by just simply filling out the form if you're under the age of 35, and then you're a member of Youngo. In terms of how to engage in our activities and work, and to and also our opportunities, of course. So we have thematic working groups, many of them, for example, on ACE, on NDCs, and also on capacity building, and many other topics highlighted by the UNFCCC. So each working group has its own projects, and some of them focus on following the UNFCCC meetings. So yeah, just join the groups, and then they will have probably weekly or monthly working group calls, and to give you an update about working groups. And I guess the most direct way would be one is just to see how it goes in the working groups, and then just join the conversation when you feel comfortable. And in another way is, of course, Youngo as a whole constituency has monthly constituency-wide calls, which will give you an introduction of what Youngo is, how it works, how to get involved in any of its work, and also any upcoming events, for example, the upcoming COP26.
Thank you so much, Kathy. It's been lovely speaking to you as always, and collaborating with you on different fronts through the PCCB network, the collaboration between Youngo and PCCB through all the side events. And yeah, looking forward to everything that you've got in store for us, and seeing you at COP as well. Thanks so much, Kathy.
Thanks so much, Rudy.